I now work as the camera specialist and rep for New South Wales for Sony cameras.
Awesome.
As an individual, should you not be inspired and be curious enough to go, I wonder how this thing works.
Exactly.
I wonder how I push the boundary.
Yep.
Not knowing how the camera works, not knowing where the guidelines are, not knowing how to create a sun flare except to use Photoshop, means that you do limit your creativity because you don't have all the tools at your disposal.
Yes.
The camera has acted as the best medium to allow me to pursue my passions. It's allowed me to meet new people. It's allowed me to photograph prime ministers, popes, some of the biggest CEOs in the world. It's allowed me to have conversations with people that I never would have normally been able to have. If you can't take a good photo on that camera, it's user error. I'm really sorry. And I'm going to offend a lot of people by saying that. But it's user error, because I can guarantee you that when I first started out, there was guys taking incredible photos on far inferior cameras than we have now. And I think that's what really sets the hobbyists apart from the pros.
Today on the Kickin' It Pod, I sit down with Nick Fraser. Nick is a creative whose camera has taken him all around the world. He's got over 10 years experience and is currently working for Sony as a camera specialist for the New South Wales region. In this episode, Nick shares how his passion for cameras has allowed him to travel the world and create opportunities where he's been able to be in the same room as some of the most influential people in the world and also work alongside some of the most talented creatives in the industry. It was actually great to be able to sit down with someone who's been in the game for so long. Photography and video has changed so much over the last 10 years and Nick's seen it all. So having him share these stories from the beginning of his career really gave me a better appreciation to the access us as creatives have to cameras and equipment and even AI features that we didn't have not too long ago. I really hope you guys do get just as much out of this episode as I did. As always, if you do find value in this episode, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world, and any feedback is always appreciated. So let's get into it. Yeah, and I knew that the more I'm around creatives, the more I'm going to learn.
And the more it grows.
Yeah, but I didn't know anyone, so I'm like, I guess I just got to figure it out on my own. And it took me a really long time. While I'm learning, I'm thinking, there is definitely a faster way to do this. And I just don't know it because I'm not around other people that are doing it. And it's because I didn't know these workshops were around back then. Like I wish I had known because I knew if I'm around other creators, I can ask these questions.
Well, that's the biggest thing. I mean, starting out, when I first started out, it was the same sort of thing. I started out commercially shooting in probably 2010, 2011.
Wow, a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yep.
And back then, I mean, YouTube was around. Socials were around, but they weren't what they are today.
Of course.
And there wasn't as much content readily available. I remember when I first started getting into photography as a hobby, and I didn't know anything. I didn't have the money to invest in courses. Courses were extremely expensive back then as well. So it was like, if you want to go and do a workshop or a course, it could be in the thousands of dollars sort of range back then. Or you had to go and work for some old geezer that was basically, he would go, shut up and stay in the corner, go do the coffee run. And it was very much the old school assisting style route, where they didn't really want you to grow too much because then you're competition for them.
Yep.
So it was a very different industry back then.
Did you do any courses? Did you take any of them on back then?
I didn't. I think the way I actually taught myself initially was I found a free introduction or basic photography guide from National Geographic, actually.
Wow.
And it was a PDF document, and it was like, I don't know, 150 pages long or something. And I printed it out on my folks' printer. It probably cost them a fortune in ink. Probably like $200 in HP printer ink. And and I just slowly read through that. And I probably absorbed about 10% of the information because looking back now, I still didn't really fully understand how it worked. I just used to read old manuals and stuff and trying to figure it out. And it's very embarrassing saying this now, but I'm sure some beginner photographers will get a bit of a kick out of it.
Of course.
Back when I started out, everything is more or less mirrorless now. So when you're shooting on a camera, you can look at the screen and it basically shows you the exposure of the screen straight up.
Yeah.
You can immediately guess what your photo is going to look like or your video is going to look like. But back when I started, it was all DSLRs. So it was a mirrorless system. You'd look through the viewfinder and you would optically see what you were seeing in whatever lighting environment you were in. And then you take the photo and it was either black or way too bright. And it was usually incorrectly exposed unless you knew what you were doing. And so the way to get around that is you use what you call a light meter. Now, in the film days, you would have a physical device that you would go over and you'd stand next to the light or next to someone's shirt, and it would either reflect or it would allow light to fall onto it. It would give you a reading, and then you'd put those inputs into your camera to get a correct sort of readout of where you were sitting. And some people still do use these. But more traditionally, in terms of DSLRs, that had switched from being an off-camera device to an on-camera device. So on the camera, it would actually tell you you're underexposed or you're overexposed. And for anyone that's looked at a camera in the last sort of 10 years, you'll see that there's a little dial down the bottom or on the side of your camera that says, has a line and it says 0. And then it has a couple of little lines.
Yes.
-1, -2, -3. And the same on the other side, +1, +2, +3.
Yep.
And I was like, why is this little line just keeps moving around at the bottom? He's telling me plus something, minus something. And I can never figure it out. And I point at different things and it changes. And I don't really get what this thing is. And no one's explained it to me. And so I shot commercially for 5 years, having no clue what this light meter was.
Yeah.
And I was at this event, and I was shooting with another photographer there, and it was this crazy event. It was like a Cirque du Soleil style performance, and you got lights going off, and there's fire, and there's acrobats spinning, and there's all this stuff moving, and smoke, and CO2, and everything's happening. It's the worst lighting environment for a photographer. Everything's changing so dramatically, so fast.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to shoot everything manually, and I'm shooting a shot that's a little underexposed, and I quickly change it, and then the lights change, and I'm watching this guy next to me on my shoulder, and he's just nails that shot, 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 nails that. I'm looking at him like, how is this guy doing it? I don't understand. I'm like, man, how you just, that's incredible. Like, you're absolutely nailing every single shot. I'm having to, most of the time, I'm getting it pretty close, but I'm often having to take a test shot.
Okay.
He's like, oh man, I just watch the light meter, and then more or less it does it for me.
Wow.
And I've kind of gone, I'm not going to ask that question. This feels like something I should know by now. I've been shooting for 5 years. I should probably know what this light meter is.
Feeling.
And I've gone home, and thankfully Google's helped me out on this one and gone, oh, well, that's what the little +1, -1 thing at the bottom of your camera is.
Yes.
And since then, it's been incredible because I've been able to expose my photographs correctly. But it actually held me in very good stead, because up until that point, I'd spent 5 years walking into a room and memorizing the settings.
Yeah.
Which is the most backwards way to do it.
Of course.
But now I can walk into a room and go, sweet, okay, I'm in this room right now. It's artificial light, not daylight, so it's going to be slightly underexposed compared to a daylight scenario. But if I'm shooting in here, I'd probably be at 3200 ISO at 1.4 at 1/80th of a second, and I'm most likely to be correctly exposed.
Wow.
Now, we can test that later and see how wrong I am. But
No, but that's great. That's really good.
But it's good. It's a nice baseline. Whereas in today's day and age, you don't have that. You can be very, very lazy with your settings and still get away with it.
Exactly. You really can. But there is so much that you can get out of a camera if you take the time to understand it, especially with how they are today compared to how they were back then. I don't think a lot of people use it to its full potential because of just realizing how capable they really are. And like what
you're not even close.
Yeah.
Like, you're not even close to hitting the point where your camera is becoming a liability now. If you're buying a high-end, $3,000-$4,000 camera in today's day and age, I think it doesn't really necessarily matter what you buy. Your skill level is most likely going to be less than what the camera is capable of delivering.
Yes.
Which is a wild change of pace compared to 10 years ago.
Completely different, right? Wow. And I think that's why these workshops and the things that Sony do are important to attend, because you can learn so much of this.
Big time. There's such a wide world out there, and there's so many settings available now, and so many more settings than were available 10 years ago as well. What you can do with a camera now is astronomical compared to your old hole-in-box setup that you had.
True.
Traditionally.
Especially if you're someone that shoots in environments like that. Like, you've done a ton of music events and outdoor events, and like you just explaining that environment to me, I'm like, I wouldn't even know how to shoot that, because it's constantly changing, right? The lights are flashing from everywhere, smoke could come out. What got you into wanting to do events when it's something that's so challenging?
I guess I kind of fell into,
because this was a while back now, right?
Yeah, this is a while back. So I guess to get to that point, I almost need to take a step back and
we'll go from the beginning.
Start from the beginning.
Of course.
So I started photographing in about 2011, as I mentioned before, 2010, 2011.
What made you get into it?
I was not working in the photography space at all.
Yeah.
And I was kind of just using it as a hobby, I guess. I bought a camera off a friend of mine. My parents had a camera, but never really photographed anything. They were very much live in the moment people. The camera came out probably maybe 100 times over the course of my childhood. And they're all, key moments, pivotal moments. But other than that, it wasn't this snap everything sort of world that we live in now. And so I guess maybe it was a knee-jerk reaction to that, being like, oh, wow, here's a camera and I can actually, there's no limit to this. There's I'm not getting charged per shot or, it's not film, right?
Yeah.
So I bought a camera off a friend of mine and I started photographing birthday parties and things like that, and especially whatever was around me, and was quite enjoying it. And then when I finished school, I actually did a completely different job to photography. So it
still wasn't on your radar when you finished school?
It definitely wasn't. I mean, this sounds very bizarre now and where my life is sort of taking me, but my goal when I left high school was to actually join the military. Wow. I wanted to join the special forces, and I wanted to do it more than anything else. I was very driven to complete that goal of mine, and so I spent most of year 11 and 12 training to become a soldier, basically.
Wow.
And was just rigorous in my fitness, my mental. I read every book you could possibly read about the special forces. I went right the way down the rabbit hole. I signed up for the ADF. I had everything ready to rock, and then I got rejected on a medical claim. So I was sitting around for a little bit. I went snowboarding, tore my knee snowboarding.
Oh no!
Have this pivotal moment of ooh, now I'm in limbo. I'm waiting around. I'm 18.
Okay.
I can't really do anything. I'm trying to stay fit in this 6-month period. I've still got to appeal. My whole life's kind of up in the air. I'm not really sure what I want to do. And I ended up getting offered a job on an oil rig in the Canadian Yukon. And so, so I ended up going and doing 6 months on an oil rig, high pressure drilling, or snubbing as they call it, which is rated the second most dangerous job in the Northern Hemisphere next to Alaskan crab fishing. So I go and do that for 6 months in the Canadian Yukon. And while I was over there, I started photographing a bunch of stuff on little point and shoots, sneakily.
Amazing place of the world, though, right? Canada's
very cool place. Just gorgeous landscape. And I was shooting, the people on the rigs and shooting these crazy environments. Everything looks just extraordinary. You've got the steam and the snow, and it's just wild, right?
Very cool.
But it was so cold, so cold. I'm talking minus 50 cold, to the point where I have this one photograph when I first started photographing there, and I want to get this panorama shot of all the rigs laid out in the snow in this forest in the middle of the Yukon. And it took me 3 days to get this one photo, because every time I'd try and start photographing the panorama, the battery on the camera would die.
Oh, wow, because it was too cold.
It's so cold. Damn. And so by day 3, I'd figured out if I kept them, in my armpits, I could get about 3/4 way through it, and then it would die. So I started ramming them in my undies. And so I'd ram the battery in my undies, and I'd leave it there, and you sit there like this for 15, 20 minutes, do a couple of jogs on the spot, then quickly pull it out, ram it in the camera, and finally got this shot.
Wow.
Which I was so stoked with at the time. It's a horrible shot in hindsight, but I was very stoked with it at the time. And so that kind of sparked a bit of a passion, I guess. And then when I finished up in Canada, I got offered an extension to that job, which was 6 months in the jungle in Papua New Guinea.
Wow.
And so I went and worked up there for 6 months as well.
Do you go looking to just adventure? How are these opportunities
seems to fall in my lap, right?
Okay.
I wasn't really looking for anything. Yep. I mean, I've been very much of a yes man my entire life. I've always been curious to learn as much as I possibly can about whatever.
I can tell.
If I'm intrigued by something, I'll dive in.
Yeah.
And I think that's gotten me into some rather unique scenarios over the last couple of years. But I basically ended up in Papua New Guinea. And in that interim period between Canada and Papua New Guinea, I thought, you know what? I wonder if I could do journalism.
Okay.
And so I hit up a local paper here in Sydney, the North Shore Times, and I said, could I write some articles for you? I'm just about to leave to go to the jungle in Papua New Guinea.
Cool.
Do you think there's a potential column for, your Sydney private school kid goes to the jungle of Papua New Guinea and meets a bunch of local guys and has this weird experience? And they were like, yeah, sounds something we could maybe publish. We're not going to pay you for it, but if you want to write free articles,
if you want to do it, go for it.
I'm like, cool, okay, sweet. So I jump on that and I start writing these articles, and the articles are pretty bland by themselves. So I start photographing to fill the articles.
Correct.
And so I'm up in the jungle. We're flying these rigs in on Chinook helicopters. I'm 18 years old. I'm given a crew of seven local.
Do you remember what
guys to
you're
run.
shooting on at this time? What are you running around with?
Ironically,
Yeah.
and this sounds hilarious, I'd never realized what I was shooting at the time because it's just a little point and shoot that someone had given me for Christmas. And it turns out it's an old Sony Cybershot.
Wow.
Which is quite funny.
Yeah, that is cool.
So I was shooting this little point and shoot, and then I eventually ended up buying, I think, a Panasonic Lumix like underwater camera because we had very stringent laws around everything being intrinsically safe, which basically means it cannot be exposed to oxygen. Like if it's electrical, it has to be in a sealed unit.
Okay.
It can't create a spark. It has to be non-static. Obviously, you're dealing in an environment where everything is flammable, gas primarily, and you don't want to go up in flames. So
True.
a sealed waterproof camera was a good option.
Yep.
And so I started, again, sneakily shooting some shots up there for all the local guys, and they all loved it because a lot of them had never seen their photo taken before.
Wow.
And some of the stories up there were just absolutely inspirational. And so I started working my way around that, publishing these articles, and I got really, really inspired by that. And I got about 6 months in, and I was like, this rigging job is destructive. It goes against sort of everything that I believe in. It's ethically wrong.
The more
it's
I find
morally
out about
wrong.
this, the worse it
It's
gets.
destroying my body. I hate it. I'm standing in the pissing rain, freezing cold. Next day it's 35 degrees. Like, I'm tired. Like, this sucks. And I was also watching my 20s sort of drift away from me.
Yeah.
You know, I met all these guys that were in their 50s and they're on the third divorce. They're mortgaged up to the hilt because they're so depressed on their days on that they gone and bought a new boat and a jet ski and a house in Hawaii, and now they can't afford it, or they can't afford to leave because they're all mortgaged. I was like, I need to get out. I need to get out now. So I left that company. They offered me $1,200 a day and a job as a driller on their rig to stay. Wow. And I turned it down, which was a very, very hard decision at the age of 18.
Yeah, especially at that age.
Yeah, $1,200 a day in 2010.
Wow.
It would have been, I could have bought myself a house within, 5 years. And
very easy
in.
to talk yourself. I would talk myself into that because I'm like, man, if I just did this for a year.
Exactly, right? And this is how so many people end up trapped.
Yes.
And so I made that very hard call. I took the money that I had made on the rigs thus far, and I bought myself a car. I bought myself a camera.
Awesome.
I bought myself a Nikon D7000.
Yep.
Which at the time was, I don't know, a friend of mine was selling it for cheap.
And when you made that decision, was it, did you know what your next step was? Like you wanted to get into...
I was like, I'm a photographer now.
Yeah,
I
cool. You just decided.
Anyone that would listen that I was a photographer now.
Awesome.
And so I went, I'm just going to go down this route. I'm going to pursue it 100%. I'm going to dive fully into it. And then I applied for uni for a media degree as well.
Cool.
And they were like, nah, dude, you made 51 ATAR. There's no way that you're getting into this course.
You're not allowed in here.
You don't have the brains for this course. I was like, oh, man, that sucks. And they said, but we're doing this thing called a non-award scheme where basically if you're willing to take a gamble and pay for your first 6 months out of your own pocket and you achieve a credit average, we'll consider letting you stay.
Yeah, cool.
And I was like, all right. So I paid the whole first 2 semesters, whatever, up front.
Yep.
Out of the money I'd made on the rigs, which was about $6,500 at the time, I think. It was a big chunk.
Yeah.
And I enrolled in the uni and I got a distinction average, and I was like, sweet, okay, I guess I'm staying.
Yeah. And
then proceeded to do 4 years in a degree that I learned very little from. Spent way too much money on.
Yeah.
But on a positive note, I ended up with them as a client. So I think in the long run, I kind of won. So I ended up with them as a client for 10 years.
Oh, wow. Long time.
Longer even. They're still technically a client. So.
Well, then you would have made that money back and more.
Big time.
Yeah.
Big time. And then I bumped into a friend of mine at an alumni event at our high school, and he'd just been back from traveling around China with the ABC, shooting some photojournalism stuff. And he's like, hey, man, what have you been up to? I'm like, I've been working on an oil rig in the Yukon and PNG. And he's like, that sounds crazy. That's a wild experience. I'd love to do something like that. I was like, I'd love to do something like what you're doing. That sounds really, really cool. And he goes, well, I'm thinking of starting a production company. I was like, okay. When do we start? I'll jump on board.
Yeah, wow.
And so I think about 3 days later, we started a production company, and he booked a helicopter. We're hanging out this helicopter flying over Sydney Harbour, and kind of the rest is history. Stayed with that company for 4 years.
And what was the aim with that company? Was there like a specific niche that you were trying to do? Like, what were you trying to accomplish? Was it just we're just going to shoot anything and everything?
We had no clue what we were doing. We were like, we're photographers.
We're photographers, and we're just going to team up. And
we had no clue. He had more of a clue than I had, but I definitely had no clue. And so,
is it basically just like, we just want to do this for a living?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, his old man was a filmmaker, and had unfortunately passed away when my friend was at a young age. So he'd kind of inherited some of that money, and he'd basically gone, you know what, I'm going to follow my father's footsteps, and I'm going to invest this into a company and start my own production company. Cool. Which, hats off to him. He pulled it off. Yep. And so, yeah, I was in the same boat. I wanted to go down that route. Yep. And so quickly we figured out that, you know what, we don't really have enough money to make it week by week. How do we keep this cash flowed? And so we fell into the event scene. This is a very long-winded answer to your question.
Great. Yeah, it's perfect.
But yeah, we fell into events, and we figured out if we shoot, you know, a couple of events a week, we can get on a retainer with those venues. Yeah. And that means that we've got a consistent income, which can cash flow the business. And then when we have the fun projects and the big projects, that's like the cream on top. Yep. And so we landed the Maryville contract. Wow. And so we're shooting all of the...
That's a good one.
That's a fairly big client.
Yeah.
So we landed that, and we were shooting between 6 and 12 venues a week. Wow. So
all through Maryville, through that one client.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that was a lot of work. Yep. And that basically kept the business afloat while we figured out what we were doing. Yeah, awesome. And helped us grow the business enough that, you know, he was able to bring on some more employees and expand. And that was really a pivotal moment for me, because having that mentorship through him and through that company, and what that opened my career up to, was massive. Yeah. Cool. Who was this guy? This was Michael Young. He runs My Media Sydney. Yes. Yeah. Got it. So he was your mentor as well as your definitely, and then became good friends. Yeah. That's fantastic. And how long do you think it took you to identify events as this is what we're going to go for? Were you guys trying different things? Because that was when I first started out. I think a lot of creators, it's like you just have to try everything, because one, you don't know what you like, and then I think there's also the part of like, well, I may like this, but the money's over here. Like, I'm getting a lot of opportunities here, and it takes a while initially to identify those two things. Were you guys trying a ton of things? How did you come to the realization that like events is where we're going to make our money? I think we probably fell into it more than looked specifically for it. He had a background as a promoter, so probably was a natural avenue for him to fall into that. I think you're totally right. Such a good sort of question or statement is that when you're starting out, you are totally lost in that field. Often you'll see that photographers or creatives, they start out following something that they're passionate about. And I think that's possibly the most positive way to start. Because it's very similar to what you just said. It's like, all I've decided was I want to do this for a living. And then how do you make that turn into money, right? Yeah. I mean, often there is that divide, though, where you're like, I'm passionate about photographing frogs, and there's no money in photographing frogs. Yeah, exactly. Unless you work for, you know, one of the biggest institutes in the world and have a contract with Nat Geo. Yes. So how do I get from backyard frog photographer to, you know, making a living out of this? And sometimes that means doing the not so fun stuff in between to get to that point. Correct. No, thankfully I never had the problem of being backyard frog photographer, but at the same time, I mean, my passion has always been people. I've always been intrigued by people and by culture. Yep. It's sort of how I started out, and something that's continued throughout my work, regardless of the genre. But in saying that, I've taken a lot of different pivots throughout my career.
I've noticed you got a wide variety of work in your portfolio, which I think is a good
Still
thing.
haven't figured out what I'm doing, evidently.
Is it just because you have like many I'm the same. I like too many things. It's very hard for me to be like, I'm just this one guy.
Yeah. I think that's very much probably me following my passions.
Yep.
Call it ADHD, call it whatever you like. I'll go down a rabbit hole. I'll learn everything there is to know about that topic. And then I'll diversify into another field that I'm passionate about.
Yep.
And for me, the camera has acted as the best medium to allow me to pursue my passions. It's allowed me to meet new people. It's allowed me to photograph prime ministers, popes, some of the biggest CEOs in the world. It's allowed me to see behind closed doors. It's allowed me backstage at concerts. It's allowed me to have conversations with people that I never would have normally been able to have.
Yeah.
It breaks down the barriers of being, not on the same playing field as someone. You can have Donald Trump standing in front of you who would normally pass you in the street and palm you off.
Yep.
But if you're there to photograph him, the guy's got to give you the time of day.
Yes.
And it really levels stuff down to a very human level, having that camera. And it acts as a free pass to a lot of areas.
Very
and
true.
I've been very, very lucky to have that opportunity because I've been able to see the world with the camera, which
I've noticed you're a very well-traveled man.
Tried my best.
And you've done a lot, but it's true. I have had that same feeling. I'm like, this camera gives me access to rooms and people that I usually wouldn't have access to. And it's because I've figured out how to use this thing that you put yourself in a situation and you look around and you're like, I'm not meant to be here, but I am because of my skill set. And I think like you've just taken that to another level, obviously, but I resonate with that feeling and that experience. And it is like, I've had people on before and it's like, man, this camera's allowed me to do so much. Like it's my ticket to getting around the world. Like my dreams are through this camera. And I think, it's very cool to hear.
It's so much more than that trying to run a business though. And I think that's what I've started to realize is I know when we were first chatting about the idea of doing this podcast, you sent me some preliminary questions and just I'm kind of intrigued about this and that. And one of them that came up was looking at how do you balance business and creativity?
Yes.
And it really got me thinking because I think obviously I kind of identify as a commercial photographer now, and part of me hates that because my intention into going into this was to be a documentary photographer and to explore adventure and lifestyle and culture. And I've very much gone down the commercial and editorial route. And so how do you make that commercial editorial work pay the bills? How do you run a successful photography business?
Yep.
And I think for a lot of creatives, they sit on one side of the fence or the other. They're a good business person and they can market well and they happen to have a camera.
Yep.
Or they're a brilliant creative and they have no clue how to run a business.
Yep.
And it's very hard to get that balance between the two.
Correct.
And I'll tell you right now, I haven't quite figured it out.
Yeah.
And I don't think I ever really truly will. I think there's a few different ways that you can do it. You can either embrace a creative and you go, you know what, this is not me. I'm not a business person. You hire someone that is really good at the business and you team up and you work together, and that's a very successful way to do it. You are very good at the business and you hire other creatives that are fantastic and you bring them in and they lift your creative game and inspire you. Or you try and do what I did for the first 5 or 6 years, which is probably not recommended, and you try and balance both and you end up very stretched thin. You learn a lot, but it's all a bit madness in between.
Yes.
And that is a never-ending seesaw trying to get that right.
I'm exactly the same. It's what I've done for 5 years. And it can be extremely overwhelming and stressful and very hard to do. But I feel like for me, it's almost like as long as I'm still in the game, like I've got to be grateful. I got into this because I wanted to use a camera and I wanted to make a living out of it. And that's what I'm doing. The amount of times I have to stop when everything feels really hard, stressful, overwhelming, I literally stop and I'm like, dude, this is what you wanted. You wanted to make a living with your camera. You picked up a camera, you said this is what you wanted to do. Now you're here and now you want to complain about it. This is ridiculous.
You put yourself in this position.
Yeah, I put myself in this position. I said yes to all these opportunities, you know, and I have to constantly keep reminding myself that. But I think more so lately, it's like I shouldn't have to live in this state of stress and overwhelm and feeling like I need to do all the business side and find time to do all the creativity side. And only maybe last year, so in my 4 years into it, I realized I need to get help. I need people to help me out. So now I've got someone that looks after all my accounts, because me, like invoicing, that was even just little things like that. The amount of things I was doing that were no longer related to being a creative was ridiculous. You know,
you're a very clever man, because it took me about 13 years to figure that out.
Yeah,
so
yeah, exactly.
I only just figured that out last year after trying to balance it for far too long.
It takes away so much time, and you end up not doing the. You think you're a creative. You're like, oh man, this is what I wanted, but I'm sending invoices, I'm taking emails, I'm chasing people for money, I'm doing all these other things that I'm not even creating anymore because I wanted to do everything. And I was too afraid to ask for help or bring someone on or hire someone or, you know, invest in people to help me out.
And I think investing is a really strong word, actually, because often we think that by balancing everything ourselves, we're investing in ourselves. We're going to get 100% of that profit from that job. We're going to keep it in our pocket, and I'm going to learn how to be a designer. I'm going to learn. You know what? I'm going to learn how to make my own curtains. And then I'm going to build my own studio. And I can add that to my repertoire of stuff that I do. I'm now a studio builder.
I'm upskilling.
And you're like, dude, that took you 4.5 weeks, cost you $10,000. You know, sure, you saved $200 from the guy that was going to come and install them for you. But now you wasted all this time, all this money. You're now broke because you just didn't work for 2 weeks and didn't get paid for it. And let's be honest, you're never going to bill out you know, curtain work for studio hire because you've got other stuff to do. And the reality is you're still going to be worse than the curtain guy, and the curtain's going to be shoddy. So
and you're not doing a good job of it anyway.
And you're not doing a good job of it. And I think it took me a long time to figure out that actually, no, I'm not losing that money. I'm giving myself more available time to invest in the things that I love. And if I just spent, you know, that extra hour that I lost paying someone to do that, if I spent that extra hour sourcing new clients or driving new work or having a meeting or building your network.
Or even just freeing up time to do the things that you really want to do, like your creative or passion projects.
And I guess the problem is when you're first starting out as a freelancer, you have all the time in the world and you don't necessarily have the clients to fill it. So when you get a client, you've got to maximize every little penny of that, because the reality is you're broken, you've got heaps of free time, and you're like, well, I've got time, but I don't have the money to pay people to do it. And that is a tricky scenario to start out in, but it teaches you a lot of really good skills really fast.
Yeah, of course.
But sometimes you have to take that leap and invest to move forwards and to grow.
And even with courses and like I did with mentors, like taking on Vienna, like they were big investments at the time when you're starting out and you're not making a lot of money, but you have to realize that it's going to help you progress a lot quicker than you would by trying to figure it out on your own.
Investing in yourself is possibly the greatest thing that you can do as a creative. I think it allows you future growth. And if you don't invest in yourself, you don't spend the time to either invest in workshops or in material or in equipment or in whatever you need to grow your business forwards, you reach a point where you become stagnant because you don't have anywhere to go. You never get any better. And we briefly touched on it before, but I think a common tactic of traditionally people that have been in the industry a long time is they get scared about new voices coming in, new talent coming in, and they shy away from allowing new people to grow. But if you can continue to grow, you can foster others as well. The bigger the pie, the bigger the piece. The more people involved, the more it lends to your creativity, the more it grows the whole bigger pool, the more it makes you lift your game, the more it inspires you to invest in yourself and in your business and in others. And it makes the whole big playing field just escalate.
Which I think is a good thing. Like that needs to be shared more, that point of view. Because a lot of people, especially now, I think maybe it is a social media thing where it does feel like there are so many creatives out there. It's easy to feel intimidated. And especially by other people. And I think especially, I bring it up all the time, a lot of us creatives or photographers, we didn't go out and do a course or a certificate. We have no certificate to say that we're accomplished and we're there. We're self-taught. We've just been on YouTube and Google, and we're afraid that we're going to get caught out. So we don't want to hang around these other guys who are going to find out that I just, went on YouTube and watched a few tutorials.
But there's nothing wrong with that.
I know.
I personally think there's nothing wrong with that. And I think the best thing you can do is be self-taught. Spend time on YouTube. Speak to people. Ask the dumb questions. There's no such thing as a dumb question. The only dumb question is the one not asked.
I agree.
Be that numpty. Just embrace it. Let the ego go. Be like, sweet, I'm a beginner. I have no clue. Ask the dumb questions. Ask people for mentorship.
Yeah.
People love to talk about themselves. Like human nature, we love to talk about ourselves.
Yeah,
I'm guilty of it. I'm sure you're guilty of it. Everyone's guilty of it, right? And so if you go to someone and you go, can I get your expertise? Can I get your mentorship? 9 times out of 10, they'll say yes. And they're happy to be the person that knows it all and gives you the answer to these questions.
True.
Go out there and source that.
True.
I saw a really cool quote by Matthew McConaughey a couple of weeks back, and I'm going to get this terribly wrong, but the gist of it, if I'm paraphrasing, was that he said it way cool. Go look it up. He says it really cool. He uses all these like
give it your
words.
best shot. I reckon you got it in you.
But essentially what he was saying was if you combine your niche or what you are really good at, the essence of your skills, and you combine that with what you're willing to sacrifice, you'll be enormously successful. Now, your niche might not be photography as a whole, but it might be that you're a photographer that happens to own a podcast studio, that happens to be really connected with the sports scene, that happens to have a background in this niche role. Now, if you combine all of those things together, and you combine them with whatever you're willing to sacrifice, whether that be money, time, energy, putting yourself out there, reputation, etc., and you throw yourself fully into that, you're going to succeed. And you're going to be the best that you can possibly be in that field. Because the more you niche down, the less competition there is.
True.
And I wish I'd taken my own advice on this 14 years ago and figured that out, because it would have really skyrocketed where I am today.
And then you start being recognized as that person, like that guy. He's the guy that has the podcast studio that does this and does that. And
you never compete on price. You never compete necessarily, because you are the only person in that niche.
And you're right, especially with a camera. If you go, just by pivoting and going into these other, niches, there's so much potential to learn there. I've got, and I'm actually later on, I'm talking to someone who is a food photographer.
Brilliant.
I know nothing about food photography, and I'm going through her work, and I'm just like, this is incredible. I wouldn't know how to do any of this.
It's such a beautiful niche, food photography. It's amazing when you see it, people do it well.
Yeah.
And there's so many different ways of doing it as well.
Exactly. And when you see it, I look at it, I'm like, I would not know how to do half of this. So just by pivoting to something like food photography, you know that there's so much room for you to grow and develop by just doing that. A car photography event, when you were talking about concerts, the amount of knowledge that's required to shoot an event is so different to what you need for food photography.
It's really been interesting. I mean, I've been very, very blessed to have mentored with some of the greats. I've had some brilliant mentors throughout my career. Many of them, advocates or ambassadors for big brands. Their work's been exhibited all over the world, and I've had the opportunity to be in the same room as them and learn from them and ask those dumb questions.
Yep.
And while I was on that, I did a lot of assisting over the years. And while I was on that journey of assisting, I assisted for a few different food photographers. And I remember one week I had 2 assisting jobs for 2 different photographers. And the first guy went in and we photographed, I don't know, a standard flat lay sort of style food presentation.
Yep.
And he used maybe like 15 lights. Like, it was crazy, man. It was so cool to watch. It was crazy. He built it like the cinema scene where he had like one fill light, and then he just kind of built and built and built and built and added more and more and more lights, and they were all targeted. This bit hits just the edge of the label.
The attention to detail is crazy.
The cherry, and that bit's just gonna splash. And you're like, man, I can't even really see that. Like I can see it, but it's like so minuscule.
Yes.
And then you look at the image afterwards, and you're like, wow, this is incredible.
Yeah.
Shot on medium format, the amount of depth in the image, it was like, you probably could do it in Photoshop now, but it was very, very impressive, the amount of detail in this image, and it had so much depth. And then 2 or 3 days later, I went and assisted another guy, and I'm like, sweet man, so how many lights we're using? What do you want to set up? Do you want any snoots on? How are we gonna, what do you want targeting? What? And he's like, oh man, I don't know. He's like, I was just gonna set the light up like over here. And I'm like, well, what modifier do you want to? Oh no, I was just gonna go bare ball pad and just pop it into the ceiling. And he's just set up next to this window, this big like window at Sun Studios, and it's kind of like an opaque window, and just fired this strobe just into the ceiling, and so untechnically minded. And the guy was on like $6,000 a day and had like 3 or 4 back-to-back food shoots every day. Like he'd be on $200,000 a year, like one of the best food photographers in Australia. And his images were gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous.
Wow.
Yeah, one light, 15 odd lights.
Yep.
More or less the same result. Well, very different results, but achieved the same outcome.
Yep.
It was very, very interesting looking at that and being like, wow, this is such opposite ends of the spectrum.
Very true.
But even within the same niche as well.
Yep. And it's interesting, and I think that's what's great about meeting other creatives is that people just have different workflow, different process. The way they go about creating what's in their mind could be very different. Even though you're both shooting like the same thing, your creative process could be completely different to mine. And the thing is, that's okay. It's
totally okay.
Yeah, and I think beginner creators, when I was a beginner, you get so caught up in like, there are rules to this. I have to follow the rules, especially when you're looking at tutorials. There's rules to everything.
Everything in photography has rules.
But I think the more you hang out with other creatives that are doing great work, you're like, that guy's not following any of the rules.
He broke all the rules.
All the rules, man.
Or he doesn't even know the rules.
He doesn't even know the rules.
Which is often the case. So, you get a lot of really brilliant creative photographers that have zero technical skills.
Yep.
And that's okay.
And that's okay too.
I'm a very technical photographer, and I think it limits my creativity as a result.
I agree. The other day I was who was I talking to? A designer, a girl who's got her own clothing brand. We were talking. Do you know Fear of God, the clothing brand?
Oh yeah.
So their founder, his name's Jerry Lorenzo. I heard him in an interview. He's never studied anything when it comes to design. He's self-taught, right? Everything's self-taught.
Brilliant.
And he attributes his success to never learning the rules. He's like, by not learning the rules, I have all this creative freedom. Because I don't know the rules, I'm allowed to experiment with whatever I want. And he thinks that's his advantage.
I think makes total sense, right?
Yeah.
By not knowing the rules and by not conforming to anything or having any set expectations, you're left on a completely blank slate.
Yeah. And allows so much more creative freedom.
Yep. You're not innovating, you're inventing.
Yeah. Which is almost to that example. You've got 2 guys doing it in a completely different way, and there's no right and there's no wrong. And learning that it's a very subjective industry was very hard for me to do in the beginning.
Yeah.
I think. And when you come to accept that, it's like, I may make something and someone may really not like it, but someone else may love it.
That's the thing. That's why you may as well niche, right?
Yeah.
We've gotten to this point now where there's a lot of humans on the planet.
Yes.
Our population is quite high. And I mean, it's probably easier in say the States versus here because you have an even bigger population and more demand for creativity over there than we do in Australia. But even in Australia, our population's quite large.
Yep.
And so you can basically niche down into whatever style or particular area you want. And as long as you market it correctly, you're going to find someone that wants that particular style.
Yes.
I mean, might not be 3 times a week, but you will find someone that loves that.
Yes.
Even if it's weird to 90% of people. And if that's your thing and you're passionate about that and you believe in yourself, follow through with it because set the trend. Why not?
Yeah, exactly. And so many people feel the need to follow trends because they see what's working and like, if it's working for all those guys, I now have to do the same.
Especially in the age of TikTok and Instagram, and you have your trending sounds and your trending.
Exactly. How do you feel about that? Like it very hard to stand out when a lot of it starts looking similar. But if that's what kind of works, if your metric for success is viewership and these metrics, do you conform to that? Like, where do you draw the line where your work becomes authentic yet still follows trends enough to
stay relevant?
To stay relevant.
It's a really good question. I mean, this is almost an existential debate for me because morally and ethically, I personally hate the idea of like spot removal on photos or actually like tweaking a photo beyond what it photorealistically looked like.
Yep.
Now I'm aware that I also do that, especially for my commercial work.
Yep.
But especially the documentary background in me goes like, I want it to be as photorealistic or as mood realistic as possible. So like if I'm there and I'm photographing something and there's a bin in the background, I'll just put the camera down and walk over and move the bin. Like I don't like, or I'll reposition, you know what I mean? Rather than being like, oh, I'll get rid of it in post.
Yeah.
And I think in today's day and age, there's a lot of that.
You hear it more and more. The amount of times I've heard, we'll just get rid of it in post. Don't worry, guys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's one element of it. And the second element of it is that we're now getting to, when I first started out, being a pro photographer was like something that was quite difficult to achieve, but it was also something that had a lot of emphasis and notoriety around it, I guess, because it was quite a hard thing to achieve. And for many, many years, I pushed for that and was like, I'm a pro. I'm not getting involved in the content creation side of thing. I'm not putting my face on any of my social profiles. I'm keeping it like, this is my work. You either like my work or you go elsewhere. And I'm not going to go and try and conform. I'm not going to try and match the people that are Photoshop removing, that are putting sun flares in their when I realized that sun flares, 90% of sun flares on Instagram are fake, I'm like, man, are you kidding me? I've been shooting everything at f16 for nothing. Like what?
Yeah.
Fog, fake fog in photos. Guys, seriously, like I didn't know, like photoshopping birds in.
Especially for someone like you, I feel like you analyze things and you try and like figure it out on your own, and yet I was
sitting here going like waiting for 4 hours for a bloody bird to fly across the top of the sky so I can make the photo. You know, sitting there in my photographer's epimorphos trying to figure out where the sun's going to be so I can get it to a line so it just peeks through this tree perfectly and then shoot it F16 or F8 and get that little sun flare and use the right glass. And to me, there's a real art form in that. But now it's like your content consumers don't know whether you've spent the time to do that or whether you've just smacked a sunray filter on it and put a bird in, and they don't really care. They're like, it's a cool image.
True.
But now we're kind of getting to this point where now it's becoming AI.
Yep.
And we're almost getting a resurgence on that because people want real. And we're now getting to the point where everything's debatably fake. Where do you draw that line? And so I had that debate with myself a long while back. Do I embrace it? And do I go down this avenue of let the ego go, Nick? Let the baseline of, you know, this is what a pro photographer is, go and chase more of the influencer, content creator crowd and try and compete in that space? Or do I stay true to what I believe?
Yep.
And what I found is that it started affecting me commercially and holding me back because I was losing jobs to guys that had less technical experience, less exposure, or not less exposure, less time in the experience in the industry, whose photos were, and I'm tooting my own horn here, but debatably no better than my own. And they had a bigger social following, or they weren't afraid to use these tools at their disposal.
Yes.
And as a result, they were getting the work over what I was.
Correct.
Now, there's no point in me getting bitter over it at all because I limited myself and I limited my own reach by having these set of moral and ethical standards.
Yep.
So where do you draw that line? And I think that's why it's such a brilliant question that kept me awake last night, is going, do you use every tool at your disposal to drive yourself forwards and as a result have a successful business, which realistically in today's day and age probably means that you conform to the trends, you use the trending audio, you use every available analytic and social tool at your disposal, you retouch your photos to the best of your ability, You get your face in front of the camera and you build your brand that way. You almost become more of an influencer than a photographer.
Yep.
Or do you go the old school route and you try and stick very documentary? And that, in today's day and age, is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, there's not very many people that can do that successfully. Yeah.
I mean, look at it this way. The Sydney Morning Herald has one staff photographer, I believe.
Wow.
Maybe two.
What do you think is the negative impact of that? Because I think the way that you were explaining, you'd see an image and then you'd try and figure out how that happened. By using all these new tools that are available to us, it means we no longer have to figure it out and learn the actual technical skills, which I don't think is a good thing. Like, you're relying so much on these tools that you no longer have to have an understanding on, like, how is it doing it. I think it's detrimental to your growth when it comes to understanding these technical skills. Or do you think we just don't need to learn them anymore?
I think in a lot of ways we don't need to learn them anymore, but I also think, and taking this on a massive tangent, as an individual, should you not be inspired and be curious enough to go, I wonder how this thing works.
Exactly.
I wonder how I push the boundary.
Yep.
Because yes, as much as not knowing the rules allows you to have full creative freedom, not knowing how the camera works, not knowing where the guidelines are, not knowing how to create a sun flare except to use Photoshop, means that you do limit your creativity because you don't have all the tools at your disposal.
Yes.
So learn the rules, learn the tools, learn the parameters, and then throw them all in the bin. But you know what I mean? Like, set your baseline and then figure out how you can tweak it.
Yeah.
And that's how I think you truly master your craft. It's a lot more time intensive, but it gets you a lot further in the long run.
I agree. And I think it is that people, the time intensive activities are people don't want to invest the time
to
learn these things. Yeah. And if you can, just give me the pill to take and I don't have to do the workouts. Give me the AI tool and I don't have to learn how to edit these photos. And these tools are now available for them so that they don't have to spend the time to actually learn it. I was going to ask you what you think separates a good creative from a great creative. While I ask that, I'm just going to say, I think it's that. The people that actually take the time to understand and learn the craft, even though they don't necessarily have to, the attention to detail that they put in, like the care factor, I think plays a big role in this for me, but I'd want to know what you think it is for you.
I've been thinking about this as well a lot lately, and I don't think there's a perfect answer to it. I think a big part of it is exactly what you just said. A piece of advice that I was given when I first started out was, you're only as good as your last gallery, which stuck with me.
Yep.
It applies more to the commercial space. Like that comment definitely applies much more to the commercial space than to say as a hobbyist. But if you're in the commercial sector, someone is not hiring you because you took a really nice photo. And I think this is where that idea of like content creators and just not really knowing what you're doing with the camera lets you fall down in a commercial sector, is that client is booking you for consistency.
Yes.
They know that if you show up and your camera shits the bed, for lack of a better word, or you rock up and your gear doesn't work, the lights don't work, the environment isn't what they said it was going to be, someone's late, this isn't working, that's not working, you don't have this at your disposal, the timeline's changed, you don't have time to edit the photos, they need to be rushed turned around, you have all these factors happening. That is where a pro knows how to solve those problems on the fly and knows how to improvise and is able to be adaptive to that environment.
Yep.
And I think that's what really sets the boys apart from the men, using an old school term, but
of course,
really sets the hobbyists apart from the pros. The number of shoots I've been on where stuff has not gone to plan would outnumber the number of shoots I've been on where stuff has run smoothly by a long shot.
Yep.
So if you can't have that full breadth of understanding of how that camera works, how those lights work, how this whole environment works, sure, that might have worked fine when it was in the perfect lighting environment. It was set up. You had the beautiful backdrop. You had half an hour with Harold to shoot the photo. Everything was perfect. But now that you're thinking on the fly and you run off your feet, that's where a true professional shines through.
Correct.
Long-winded answer, but
no, but it's a great answer, and it brings to mind. I had Clyde on, who we both know not long ago, and I asked him who are the photographers that inspire him and why. And he said the guys that inspire him are the guys that can consistently create great results. They know how to get it. It's not, you just a random good shot here and there. Like you said, you're only as good as your last gallery. It's like these guys know their craft. They know exactly the shot they want to get. And regardless of what situation you put them in, they're going to deliver a great result. And it makes sense.
And that's why you're paying with your high-end photographers. That's why you're paying someone a massive day rate, because you're not paying for that 5 minutes of time that it takes to shoot the shot. You're paying for the 10 years or the 15 years and the hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment and experience that go into that 5 minutes. Because if it runs smoothly, you're fine. But as soon as it goes wrong, that's where all that experience comes into play.
But you can almost anticipate these things happening, though, because there are times where I'm like, if I don't speak up now, I'm not going to get I know from doing this, I'm not going to get the result that they want if I don't say something right now.
That is actually one of the best pieces of advice that I'd completely forgotten about. That about maybe 5 years ago, I had that exact same realization. So I'm glad you've made this same discovery and so much earlier in your career. Is if there's something that's not right, speak up.
Yes.
You are there. You're especially commercially. You are hired to be the professional. If that shot's not right and the client is the reason for that, they don't care. Because they've still got to go to their boss and be like, "Oh, yeah, we took this really shit shot," and they're not going to admit that they got it wrong. They're just going to blame you. So if something is not right, be polite. But it's your job to ensure that it goes smoothly and it works out. So speak up, have the self-confidence, trust in yourself, back yourself, and make sure that it aligns with something that you're happy to put your name on as well.
Exactly. And a lot of the times that's your only opportunity to fix it. You can try to fix things in post now with all these tools, but there are so many times where I'm like, it's so much better to just interrupt. Even with recording these pods, man, there's been times, it's been a whole learning experience for me. It's been over a year now. I've probably shot hundreds. So now I have the confidence to say things. But when I first started out, I'd be back there and the smallest things would happen and I'd be back there freaking out thinking, they're not going to like this. And it'd be things like maybe someone's microphone was like covering their face. I hate that. Drives me nuts. But you don't realize till you're editing it afterwards. And you're like, oh man, I can't change this. I'm screwed. And the next time it happens, I now know to just interrupt if I realize, hey guys, I know we're 5 minutes in, but we've got to move this mic. Otherwise, when I deliver this, you guys are going to be very unhappy. Or even just...
How good are mic stands, by the way? Like years of shooting music. Oh, man, I hate them as a photographer. It's like every single musician mic stand is like right here and you're like, man, what are you doing?
Man,
it's in your face.
Nuts.
And then there's like all these little black lines in the background.
Yeah, it drives me nuts.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, so I pick up, and that's all come from experience, from doing, I would easily done 100 of these now. You pick up on all those little details that make it better that most people would not know the first time they're in here.
Big time.
And
there's on the flip side though, there's also this kind of barrier where, and I've seen this happen on shoots a million times, like camera dies.
Yeah.
And you're like, I have to be the pro right here.
Yes.
And you're like, nobody fucking say anything. The whole team's quiet. You're just staring at this blank screen. And you got like the B cam going. You're like, we're okay. We're going to cut to B cam.
Yeah.
And you're like, get your iPhone out or something like that. Someone just fix it. And everyone's silent. Mayhem is ensuing. And you're like, yep. Shot looks great. No, fantastic. I really like, that B cam. Just the light was actually so much nicer than the A cam. Like it was really nice. Do you mind if we actually just shoot a second shot of this over here near the window? And I'm actually going to, could we just get you to rehash that last bit? That was I just thought it was brilliant what you were saying. And you're like dying on the inside.
Yes. I know the feel. I think you have to be ready for situations like that. They happen.
Big time.
and being able to be a problem solver. And it comes with experience, man. It comes from understanding your equipment and your tools.
Big time.
That's awesome. That's that's really good. I want to talk, like, outside of just the drilling career that you had, you've done a lot of traveling. You're a guy that loves to travel. I saw that even your honeymoon was hiking in Scotland.
Yes, it was. It was a good trip, actually.
When I saw that, I'm like, this guy just loves getting
the
out
poor
there.
wife. No, she's fantastic. She's just as well traveled as I am. I mean, it probably comes from being an expat kid. I, as you can probably tell, have a bit of an accent.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where it's from.
Yeah, you're Denikin fit. Speaking of it. So I was born in Aberdeen in Scotland originally.
Okay.
And I lived there till I was 4, and then I moved to the States.
Okay.
And I lived there for 3 years. My mum's American.
I was going to say, you've got a bit of an American.
Yep. So my mum's Texan. How y'all doing?
Very good.
And then my dad is very broad Scottish.
Okay.
So opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yep.
So I grew up saying things like flash torch and trash bin, and I was a very confused child. And my old man was in the oil field. So he had a career in oil field, and that's how I kind of fell into that.
Okay, makes sense.
So as a result, for work, just like a military kid or someone working, in medical or something like that, we traveled a lot. And so we're back in the UK for a couple of years after the States. Then we moved to Brunei.
Brunei, wow.
So lived in Brunei for 2.5 years.
This is at a young age, very young age.
Yeah, it would have been 9, I think, when we moved to Brunei. I think I'd moved houses something like, I'm probably going to get this wrong, like 17 times by the time I was 15 or something.
Wow.
What? Yeah, like quite a lot. I think I'm up to like my 26th move or something now.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people say that traveling changes their perspective of the world.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And for anyone that is, in high school, not that anyone in high school has probably got the attention span to make it through my ramblings for the last 40 minutes. But if you are in that space and you're looking for inspiration, you don't know what you want to do, you maybe know you're passionate about photography, or you want to go into the media sector or something in that space, but you don't really know why or how to start. My best advice would be to go traveling, because you will learn more about yourself, about culture, about people, about random topics than you ever normally would. And it's condensed into such an intense, short period of time. It really cuts through to your core and makes you understand the basics of life as well. Personally, I've spent a lot of time in third world countries, and I love it because it makes me a lot more grateful for what I have and where I am, and also allows me to break life down to a more basic level.
Yep.
You realize you don't need a lot. Like, you can pretty much survive with the clothes on your back or with stuff in a small backpack for an endless amount of time. And that's pretty cool. It has a certain, beauty to it, I guess.
True.
Life is stripped back a lot.
And
a lot of basics.
I feel like I feel like I need to remind myself of that, because I get in positions where I feel stressed out because of the need of, like, wanting more.
Materialism is the worst, especially in the city. Like, it's just in your face all the time.
Yeah, materialism, and just like, I feel like I always need to be progressing. I always need to be doing more and achieving more and having goals. And sometimes you need experiences like that to give you a bit more perspective and show a bit more gratitude for what you have and
where you've gotten. Yeah, we think we need the new this and the new that, and I need to buy. And you end up in this space where you have all the gear and no idea.
Yes.
And you have so much stuff. And I'm very guilty of this. I'm the worst for this.
So am I,
I'll click on every single Instagram,
so
buy that.
I get influenced so easily.
So easily. But, it has very much replaced, and it leaves us always wanting more, and it leaves you feeling very empty.
Yes.
And so sometimes taking that step back and looking at your own work and being like, wow, okay, in the last 5 years, I have actually progressed. I have made it quite far. And it's really, really cool seeing that, especially from a travel perspective, seeing other unique perspectives.
Does having the ability to document these things encourage you to travel more?
Big time.
Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah.
Because it gives you a purpose and makes you be more curious about it.
I agree.
Like, it gives you like I said before, with the camera being able to open doors,
Yep.
you'll go over and speak to that random person that you never would have normally connected with. You'll go and take the photograph, and then you want to learn their story, so then you end up having some random chat with some lady in a bar at 2 o'clock in the morning talking about her 14 grandchildren and how she survived the Holocaust or whatever, and you're like, wow, this is crazy. I would have never had this experience normally.
Yes, with people and in general. I remember watching a YouTube vlog, and a guy went out with his mate, and he said there's so many things, like reflecting back, that he wouldn't have done if it weren't for them having cameras. Like, they wanted to hike this mountain at sunrise. He was like, they were so tired that there is no way, if they didn't have cameras, like, they would have just slept in.
You would have slept in for sure.
Exactly, and it
Not a
forces
chance.
you to have these experiences because of your camera and wanting to be creative. I think there's so much benefit to that.
Big time.
You've traveled so much. Are there times where you wish you had taken more photos, or you wish you had captured them to remember them? Or is that something you don't feel?
It's hard, and I mean, it's something I've always struggled with. Photography, if it becomes a job, can lose some of its passion.
Yeah, man.
And its pursuit of, being this hobby and this beautiful thing that you love and enjoy.
Yes.
For me, for such a long time, photography was like, if I was in a really bad mood or just been in an argument or stressed out or whatever, it was like a meditative relax for me.
True.
I'd go and put some music in, I'd just go and wander with my camera and I'd just go and photograph a bunch of stuff, and that was like a way of me almost meditating, I guess.
Yep.
Because you've got to really think about the moment, and I can see why I'm not really a landscape photographer, but you can see why landscape photographers love that so much, because it's just the silence and the some beauty in setting up the tripod and sitting there and waiting and getting it all right. And you do kind of lose that if you go down the commercial route.
I've heard a lot of photographers say, especially landscape photographers, that's their escape.
Which there's a real beauty to that.
Yep.
And I think for a big time, I had all the gear. Like all the gear. Everything I had was pro.
Yep.
But I was like, I'm not lugging this 3 kilo kit with me. Like I'm just not going to do it. Like unless I'm getting paid, I'm not picking that thing up.
Yes.
And it actually become a chore. And so now with these sort of trips, like this trip next week, I've again tried to diversify to keep myself inspired. So we talked about diversifying into different fields. This trip, I'm just going to take a small compact camera. I'll probably take a little A7C2 or a CR or something, and like a 40mm lens.
Yep.
That's it.
That's it.
Just one lens, one body.
Yep.
And it will limit me, and I'll probably just take one card as well, maybe even one battery, and just charge it as it goes.
Okay.
And that will really limit me to going too ham, and it'll make me think about my shots.
Yes.
And it pushes you into a creative corner. And I think I do really enjoy that. I did that when I went through Sri Lanka and Nepal as well. I took just a 50mm, and it was, some of those photos are my favorite photos because I had to be really creative with them.
I've heard a lot of people say that when they shoot film photography, like a certain number of shots, and you have to be really intentional with the shots that you take.
I do that with my film camera as well, and then I just never take any photos with it because I'm like, oh man, I don't want to use the film.
Yes, that's so true. That is.
Or I shoot a bunch and I'm like, they're amazing, and then I'm like, I want the role now. And then it's like 9 months later and the moment's passed and like I finally developed the film and I'm like, oh man, this would have been great 9 months ago.
True.
I haven't quite mastered that one.
But it's great. I like that idea and that concept too of creating limitations. Like we were talking about, like not having rules, but you can be so creative when you do set boundaries and rules for yourself.
Yep.
It's so weird because it sounds so counterintuitive. Like you can, by saying I'm only going to give myself a certain amount of shots, I'm going to take one battery, one lens, you now have to be way more creative because you've given yourself rules.
Well, we're overwhelmed by choice. And I think, since we're on the lens topic, lenses are one of the biggest, if I'm in a rut and I go and buy a new lens, they're one of the biggest sort of creative eye-openers. Even like if I'm at a shoot and I'm photographing something and I'm like, this is really not working.
Yep.
I don't know why, but it's just not working. Go and change your lens. Like 9 times out of 10, that will solve it.
Yep.
I've found, at least for me personally. just go change it to anything. And then you get another one, you're like, this is definitely not, this has gotten even worse. But like, you change your lens and it really changes your mindset.
Yes.
And I think one of my biggest creative cripples was when I went from, so I did the standard creative journey of most photographers, and you buy like a 24 to 105 or something, like it does everything.
Yep.
And then you try and be like, I need more reach. Then you buy like a 70 to 450 mil or 500 mil or 527 or something random, right? And it's usually like a 4.5 to 6.3 or something because you bought the cheap model and it doesn't really work.
Very
and
good,
it's horrible in low light and you never use it and you lug it around and you end up selling it for a tenth of what you bought it for. And then you're like, I'm going to buy primes. And you sell all your glass and then you go and buy all primes. You're like, I'll get a 24, I'll get a 35, I'll get a 50, I'll get an 85. I'm going to go nuts. You buy all the primes, and then you're like, oh man, now I'm like a commercial shooter, and I have to lug this case that's like 30 kilos.
I got all this stuff.
Oh man, I got all this stuff, and you're like shooting an event, and you're like, oh man, I'm on the 24, and someone's asked me for this, and then I have to run back to my bag and change it to another lens, and then you got to buy 2 bodies, and then you got 2 bodies and multiple lenses, and then you're like,
me now.
I'm just going to go and buy a 24 to 70, 200 and a 16 to 35. So then you go and buy the Holy Trinity, which is a 16 to 35, 24 to 70, 7200. Sweet, I can shoot anything. And then all your work just tanks because you're like, you've had this beautiful creative like structure of all your prime lenses, and you're like, I'm not walking over there. I'm just going to. And you zoom into 70 mil and you shoot from where you're standing.
Yes.
And suddenly you're overwhelmed for choice because you can shoot everything with those 3 lenses. And you end up becoming lazy again. So then it's this journey of trying to force yourself to stay creative, to not get lazy, to take the extra step, to use the leg zoom. Go for the wander over there rather than just zooming in from standing back. And I think it's something that every creative is going to struggle with.
They're big decisions, especially because it's such an investment. When people first start out, it's like there are so many things to buy. It's like, what do I get to start out? If someone were to buy like their first kit, what would you suggest?
Well, this is funny you should ask this. This is now my day job.
Yeah.
So
right up your alley.
For those not aware of my bias, I now work as the New South Wales Retail Territory Specialist in Digital Imaging, which for layman's terms is basically camera specialist and rep for New South Wales for Sony cameras.
Awesome.
And so my job essentially involves me training people and running events surrounding Sony cameras and running workshops and teaching people photography.
Amazing job.
It's great. It's so, I think I'm a much better, and you guys can happily renege on this, but I think I'm so much better of a teacher than I am a photographer.
Okay, cool.
I'm smart enough to know that my work is definitely not up there as one of the greats. There's definitely people that have far better work than I do. But I think I've really kind of found my niche with teaching.
Which is awesome. I've always believed like if you can't teach something, you probably don't understand it well enough. So putting yourself in a position and being hired to be someone that does teach shows that, you know your stuff.
Well, it makes you learn your stuff a lot more.
Yeah, it does force you to learn stuff.
It's actually great trying to learn to teach something because it makes you... People ask you the weirdest questions, and you're like, oh, man, I have no clue why I do it like that.
Yeah.
Like, what does ISO mean? And you're like, I don't know, it's just ISO, dude.
That's just what...
It's just what it's called. It's just a number. And they're like, yeah, but what does it mean? And you're like, oh, my God. Okay. ISO is the International Standard Organization, and it was an organization formed just after ASA, which was the American Standard Association that used to do grading on different levels of stuff. And now ISO does ISO numbers for everything. Next time I'm driving past a truck, have a look at the side of the truck and you'll probably see ISO 1206 or something, which is like petrol or diesel or whatever.
No way.
And ISO numbers are on everything. They're on all sorts of products.
Wow.
So there you go. There's a fun fact for you.
Yeah. Which you wouldn't have learned if you hadn't have been
probably
asked
wouldn't have learned that.
Or...
Exactly. So it makes you learn a lot more about your craft.
Yeah.
But I completely forgot what tangent we're going on here. I don't even know what asked the question.
The kit that
that's right.
That you suggest a beginner to have.
What I normally break people down into is I want to understand what you're shooting and where you're at in your creative journey.
Depends on what you're shooting and what you want to get into, right?
So the flow chart, the way I go through it is, so how long have you been photographing? So then I'm basically trying to niche them into like, are you at very beginner level? Are you at middle level? Or are you at pro level?
Yep.
Now, say you're a beginner, which is kind of what you've just asked me.
Yep.
Do you like to shoot landscape, that sort of thing? If you're asking me that sort of question, you've got to have a wide angle.
Yep.
Because if it's landscape, you got to shoot something wide.
Yep.
But I'm also a bird photographer. Great. So now you're the opposite end of the spectrum, right? So now you need a telephoto. So that's like my first sort of thing.
Yes.
Here's what you want to shoot. So if we're trying to cover birds and landscape, which is probably the most tricky one to do because it's the opposite ends of the spectrum.
Sure.
And we have a budget,
Of
course.
course.
We just started at. Oh, and we also like traveling. So now it needs to be lightweight and small.
Yep.
Then it's probably a Sony A7C II because it's the cheapest of the compact cameras with a 20-70 f4. Low light performance is pretty good on that camera, so you can get away with it being f4, and it's cheaper than buying a 2.8. And by being a 20-70, slightly wider than a 24-70. So you don't have to go and buy a 16-35, which is another $2,000.
Yep.
And then you go and buy a 70 to 200 mil f4
For the birds.
macro, half macro.
Yep.
For the birds. But then that's not enough reach, 70 mil. So then we need like a 100 or 400. But that's really expensive and it's big and it's heavy, so it doesn't tick our travel category box.
Yes.
So then you go and buy a 1.4 times or 2 times teleconverter, which is substantially cheaper, smaller, lighter than buying another lens. Now that does bump up your base aperture performance. So instead of being an f4, it's now an f8 if it's a 2 times or f5.6. Someone's going to correct me on that.
And this is when you get the adapter.
The adapter.
Yep.
So you lose a little bit of light, but let's be honest, you're probably photographing in daylight anyway. So that's kind of negligible.
Yes.
It also means you just saved a couple of grand.
Yep.
And then you're probably going to go on the exact journey that I just said everyone completes, and you're probably going to sell it all and buy all new gear. But at least that gets you kind of in a really good baseline to do most things. If you want to go the commercial route and you want to go down that sort of route and you want something that a pro is going to have, it's a really hard debate for me because my initial gut says the best investment for them is going to be 16-35, 24-70, 70-200, and it would be bought in a 24-70 lens first because it can do everything, and then a 70-200 or a 16-35 depending on what they're shooting.
Yep.
And they would probably go and buy a Sony A7 IV, which for a long time was the world's best-selling mirrorless camera because at that price point it's an incredible camera.
Yep.
It does more than you're ever going to learn how to do as a beginner. But then the other part of me is like, go and buy yourself a 50 mil and just don't shoot on anything else. Force yourself into a corner.
True.
And you will creatively improve far faster. So maybe you
That's
do
a good
both.
point.
Maybe you throw a 50 in there and you shoot all your personal work on the
point.
50, and then you shoot on your 24-70 and your 70-200 for your commercial.
That's a good point. And I think a lot of it does come down to knowing what you are going to shoot.
And that's the really hard part. We're spoiled for choice now. We have every camera that's been released in the last 5 years. Okay, that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but 90% of cameras that have been released in the last 5 years, if it cannot do, if you can't take a good photo on that camera, it's user error. I'm really sorry. And I'm going to offend a lot of people by saying that. But it's user error, because I can guarantee you that when I first started out, there was guys taking incredible photos on far inferior cameras than we have now. And if you go back to your granddad, or you go back to the Vietnam War, where you have Pulitzer Prize winning photos that were shot on a 24 exposure film camera that had manual focus, and they were still nailing them.
Yep.
Or you go to old Rolling Stones magazine shots of concerts that were shot on like 800 ISO film.
It's a very good point.
It's wild. And it's like you wait until that light, like you're literally watching the lights, like green, yellow, blue, green, yellow, blue, green, yellow, blue, green, yellow, blue, green, yellow, boom.
Yep.
Shoot. You know, you're waiting for that moment, and it makes you really, really push the boundaries.
True. That's very true. So now, do you think I feel like there's new cameras coming out all the time.
All the time.
And then especially creatives that, I guess the creatives that I know that are doing it for a living always feel the urge that like they need to upgrade. But you don't necessarily have to.
As your New South Wales Sony rep, you should go and buy a new camera.
I was going to say, I was like, I don't know if I should be going into this one.
But as a creative and taking a step back from my biases, my role at Sony, I would say it's very easy to fall into the trap of feeling like you need new gear to improve,
Yep.
the best camera is the camera that you have on you, and I will always support that. There will be scenarios where that camera that you have on you might not be able or reaches its limitations.
Yep.
And if it is creatively holding you back and you've done everything you can creatively to reach the limit of that item, 100% upgrade.
Yep.
There's also the other side that is like, is it going to make your workflow and your life easier?
Yes.
And if that's the case, go buy a new camera. Like, especially commercially, time is money.
I agree.
If it's improving your workflow,
when you're doing
better menus,
when you're doing it for
better-
work, I 100% agree.
100% buy more.
There are times you don't even realize until you buy the camera. You're like, wow, I'm saving so much time because of this.
Big time, especially when you're tied to it all the time. But I also think there's hobbyists that don't necessarily need to buy the newest, highest end, top spec gear.
Yep.
And still will. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If it's your hobby and it's something you're passionate about and it's something that you want to invest in, go for it.
Because it's such a big investment, whether it's bodies or lenses, I've heard a lot of people, I've never done it and I probably should. There's a lot of people that will hire out bodies and lenses to try out to decide whether they should actually make the investment or not. Is that something you recommend?
Look, I've never personally hired them out, apart from big commercial shoots, like where you're shooting TV commercials or something like that, and you need like substantial high-end, $50,000, $60,000 cinema cameras, and you're like, sweet, okay, makes sense to go and hire this out. But again, coming back to my role at Sony, one of the beautiful opportunities of going to things like workshops is that the gear is there, it's available.
True.
So
That's a good
you can go to a
point.
workshop, you can touch and try that
Yes.
gear, you
People
can have a
need to
play with
more and
it.
more people. The more I hear about these workshops, the more I realize, like, if you're a beginner, like, there's no reason why you shouldn't be going to these because you get to use the equipment. You get to use equipment that you don't have access to.
Big time. And I mean, I'm just going to go for a shameless plug here.
Go for it.
But from a Sony perspective, they have a website called Sony Scene.
Yep.
Scene as in like the scene of a movie, not. Yeah.
And that's
So-
where everything's.
So they throw a bunch of events up there, daily, weekly. There's hundreds and hundreds of events that happen on there. And you can learn from brilliant creatives such as some of them, the creatives
Clyde.
you've had here
Yep.
on the podcast,
Joe,
Clyde
yep.
and Joe and Vienna. And that's a brilliant resource.
Yep.
A lot of them are free or very low monetary value, and compared to paying for $6,000 for a uni degree plus all that hex debt,
Yep.
you're probably going to learn a stack more in that session than you
Or
would doing
hiring
that.
the equipment
or
yourself.
hiring the equipment. You get access to all that. A lot of people ask me why Sony, like why go Sony, and if I did learn anything from my uni degree.
Yeah.
I've really canned this degree, I'm so sorry. But if I learned anything from my uni degree, it was that everything has bias and check your sources. And I think 1,000,001 times you can go online and you can check something, what's the best camera, and it tells you like it's a Fuji something, and then you go and check something else that says it's a Sony something, and you go and check something else that says it's Canon, Nikon. You need to check your sources and see what that bias is to understand why you should take or listen to that recommendation.
Yep.
As I've just said, I have a massive bias. I work for the company.
Of course.
I also come from a commercial background. Having said that, I've also shot on Nikon, Canon, Fuji, Red, Arri, Blackmagic, like Sony, you name it, I've shot on it.
Yeah.
I've shot on a lot of different systems. And they all have their idiosyncrasies. They all have their positives and their negatives. And buying any camera system is a risk because realistically you're investing thousands of dollars, especially if you might be thinking, nah, cool, I'm just buying this body and this lens to see if I like it. But if this becomes something that you're going to seriously invest in, you're going to end up 50 grand down the rabbit hole before you know it.
Yes.
And you're looking at me now and go, there's no way I'm spending 50 grand. Come here, but watch.
Yeah, watch.
Just
Give it some
hang
time.
out there. Give it some time. 50 grand later, you're going to be like, damn, I should have listened to Nick.
Yeah.
But if you're going to spend that much money on camera equipment over the next 10 years, you should be thinking, how am I planning this out?
Yeah. Correct.
And so you are basically taking a bet, you're taking a gamble, and you're gambling on which company is going to provide you with the best service for the next 10 years. Personally, I've gambled on Sony.
Yep.
10 years ago, it might have been a different brand because the Sony camera mirrorless system didn't really have as big a place in the industry as it does now. 10 years ago when I started out, Canon was massively prevalent and Nikon. They were massive players in the space. In the DSLR world, they were leading. And then mirrorless came about and Sony kind of hit the field, and everyone's like, this isn't a pro camera.
Mm.
No way, DSLRs will never die.
Yeah.
And I was guilty of that. I gambled on the wrong horse. I was sitting there going, nah, there's no way that I'm ever going to come off a DSLR. Look at me now.
Yeah.
I work for the number one leading mirrorless camera on the market. So
True.
I think now that we have switched to the mirrorless game, Sony now has 10 years lead on where everyone else is sitting. So now you have 70, 80 lenses at your disposal. You have all this, massive amount of network of R&D, from their audio and their TVs to their sensor designs.
True.
Their sensors are in all your medical grade equipment. They're in, up until recently, they were in all the DJI drones. They're in the iPhone. They're in Nikon cameras. They're in Fuji cameras. They're in some of the Canon cameras. Like it's wild how much investment they put into that. And from what I can see, taking a roll of the dice, they're the best bet on the market.
True. And I've noticed
someone else
too.
might have a different bias, and,
Of course.
and you're entitled to that opinion. But,
True.
yeah.
And I just feel like they're also doing great in terms of like building community, more so than others. I don't know if that's just a Sydney thing. I think I see it more online as well in the States as well.
I'll take that one.
You take that. Yeah, this is you, right up your alley. But it's what we were speaking about earlier. Like I didn't know people when I first started, and these networking workshops and community groups help you do that. That I don't see other brands doing. Maybe they are, but my feed's full of all these workshops that I think are really important, especially for the community and for finding other creatives that are out there doing it.
And having mentors as well, and meeting like-minded
Yeah,
people.
man, totally. The amount of times I'm like, I did get a mentor eventually, but when I did, I was like, I should have done this so much earlier. And then even now, knowing, the more you meet people, you realize how much further along you have to go. And I think the need for mentors just gets you there a lot sooner, and you learn so much quicker, and you create more experiences that put you into situations where you're forced to learn.
And even just differing views as well.
Yeah, man.
Like even if someone does what you do, they're going to do it differently. They're going to have
Yes.
their own little system. And if you can approach that with an open mind, where you're not sitting there going, I know best.
Yes.
As soon as you, I do it this way, I know best. You're immediately lost any room for growth.
Exactly. Everyone can teach you something. Even if you feel like you're further along than someone else, someone may have like a specific workflow or a way that they do things that you can learn from. I genuinely think everyone can teach you something.
Definitely. I've learned a lot here today just speaking to you.
Yeah, these conversations are great, man. This is, as much as like the amount of time I put into this, and there are times I think, especially later, I'm like, I've spent so many hours building this podcast up, and it's like there is no financial return. It's like zero.
There is massive financial return up here, though.
Exactly.
You are learning
exactly
massive amounts from these.
In so many other aspects, am I getting a return from this that are not financial, that I feel so grateful to have started this and to get the opportunity to meet people, because before this, man, I would have known personally like a handful of creatives and many that I just follow online but never met in person, which I think is a cool part of socials. But to actually like sit down and hear people's stories and how they do things and how they've gone about building a career, it makes you realize that there's so many ways to do this, man. Like so
time.
many different ways to do this, and you can't. I think the comparing to other people and thinking, well, that guy did that way, therefore I have to do the same, gets completely obliterated when you see that so many people can do it in so many different ways. And you've got to kind of just trust yourself. And if you do what you love, like you were saying earlier, there are people out there who will love it too.
Big time.
And you can really create a career and a fulfilling one. I'm sure that you look back at what you've done, there's probably memories and experiences that couldn't have been replaced if you didn't have a camera with you.
There's a brilliant quote, I'm going down the cliche route today, brilliant quote by, I think it's Randy Commissar. And he says, the greatest risk of all is not doing what you want on the bet that you can buy yourself the freedom to do it later. And it's stuck with me over the years, because it's very, very true. I mean, you can go the safe route, and there's nothing wrong with this. You can take that gamble and ask me this question again when I'm 80 and old and decrepit and have no money. But you can do the safe route, and you can go and get an in-house job, and you can get the house and the mortgage and invest now, and then you will have that freedom when you're later to go and do everything you want because you've built that solid foundation. Or you can take. But that's a gamble, right?
Yep.
You might end up sick. You might end up,
you might not get to that point.
Unable to get to that point. Or you can go and try and do all that stuff now and risk the opposite consequences down the line. It's trying to find that balance. And I think one thing that stayed with me is money comes and goes, but experiences last a lifetime.
Yep.
I've had such a very blessed opportunity to have so many varied experiences and to do them when I'm young as well, while I'm young and fit and able. I mean, I'm in my early 30s now and already, you have a couple of beers and you wake up and you're like, oh my God, I'm in agony. Or, I sleep on a rough floor and I'm hurting the next morning compared to what I was in my 20s. You're so much more young and capable when you're younger. So go out and take all those opportunities. Push yourself to your limit. Do it while you're able.
Yep.
I mean, you hear so many people when they're older saying, I wish I had the knowledge that I have now, but more than that, in the body of my younger self.
Of course.
Because eventually you get to the point where you can't physically do those things.
I agree. And I'm so glad you said all that, because before coming in, I was looking through all the work that you've done, and you are an example of someone who does just that.
I'm hurting now. Hurting already.
This is cool. The last thing I did want to ask you, though.
Yeah, for sure.
If you were to have, you've done a lot. Huge, many years of experience, many projects. I'm sure you've taken many photos. If all of it were to disappear tomorrow, everything disappeared except for one photo or one project that you've done, one got to stay. What are you going with?
Oh, it's a huge question. Probably my Mongolia footage.
Okay.
Just because it was so unique.
True.
And I think it's such a wild country that already, even since 2018 when I was there, which is almost 7 years ago, although I've never done anything with the footage or the photos, like them literally just set on a hard drive, I think that country has already changed so dramatically, and already we're seeing, China moving big mining companies into that region. It's already become so, different than it was
when you were there.
When I was there.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I'd probably hold on to them. I don't know. There's probably no right or wrong answer to this.
There's no right or wrong answer. And usually it's the one that means the most to you. I find it fascinating when you ask a lot of, especially photographers, like what their favorite photo is.
Yeah.
It's usually not like the best photo.
No, it's the thing that means the most to you.
Exactly. And I think the great thing about photography is like there are stories that are attached to these photos.
Yeah. And
having them there and having those stories behind it are usually the ones that are the most meaningful, rather than the banger photo that has the sun flare and the birds flying in there.
Yeah.
It's not that. That's not what you remember.
Like for me personally, the photos that I love the most are the ones that have taken the most physical or personal challenge or hardship to achieve.
Exactly.
Like I have a photo in this cave that's looking out in the entrance of the cave, and it's a pretty average photo realistically, probably
the Bat
for
Cave.
Most people. The Bat Cave.
I saw it.
And I had to swim into this bloody cave with a dry bag.
Yep.
And there was 100,000 plus bats in there, and you're standing up to your knees in bat poo with bats flying around it. And then it shot at a 15th of a second at 10,000 ISO on 1.4 or something, holding my breath handheld in 2014 or something. So there was no image stabilization, but that photo for me has so much impact.
Exactly.
But to anyone else, pretty average photo, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
But to you it has so much behind it.
Yeah.
Epic. I love it.
Thank you.
All of it, man.
Thank
you
you
for
so
taking
much for this
time,
opportunity,
man.
by the way. I
problem
appreciate
at all.
you taking the time to set all this up and put this together for all the viewers
I
as well.
appreciate it, man. Every time I have someone in, I'm learning, like we were talking about with the work that we do, I'm learning to be more grateful. Like these people have like taken the time out of their day to come down, like to talk to me. I'm like, who am I? And they share so much. And I feel like I have an audience that's growing. And when I listen to something, when I hear people share stories, I look back and I'm like, would me 5 years ago have benefited from this? And I truly think I would have after listening to this. Like, so thank you for sharing so much, man. Your stories, your experience, like so many people can benefit from that. And I appreciate you sharing that with me.
Thank you for making this a readily available, tool for people to use. It's incredibly inspiring that, you're taking the time to do this.
Yeah.
And to follow your passion as well. I mean, like you said, there's no financial gain here. It's brilliant that you're, putting this together and making it available for people.
Yeah. Thank you, man. Thank you. It's good. It's good to see other creators just working together. There needs to be more of it.
Well, thank you so much, and I'll see you at the next one, I guess.
Definitely. I'm coming to a workshop.
Beautiful.
I've made it. It's one of my goals.
Unreal.
Yeah.
I highly recommend that anyone that is looking to pursue their career in that space, please come on down to a workshop, and I'm more than happy to share whatever I can.
Awesome. I'll put links to all of that, the Sony scene and everything.
Beautiful.
As well.
Unreal.
All right. Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Legend.
Bye for now.